Hey everyone, and welcome to another deep dive. You ready to explore something that could totally change how you think about software development?
I am.
We're going deep on the single environment paradigm. And I know what you're thinking. It sounds kind of crazy, right?
Well, it is a pretty big departure from the way most of us are used to working.
Right. Like we're all familiar with the whole separate environments thing.
Yeah.
You build in development test in a staging environment and then, fingers crossed, you push it to production.
Yeah, and hope for the best.
Exactly. But what if I told you there's a way to do all of that in just one environment?
One environment. How does that even work?
Well, that's what we're here to find out. We've got an expert here who's going to break down how this single environment thing actually works in practice. And trust me, it's more than just merging a few servers together.
It's really a whole new way of thinking about the development lifecycle.
Okay, so before we get too deep into the single environment world, let's talk about why the traditional approach, with its separate environments, can be such a pain. Sometimes it feels like you're juggling chainsaws, you know.
I know what you mean. Keeping everything consistent across all those different environments. It's a nightmare.
What are some of the biggest problems you've seen developers face in that kind of setup?
It's like you're trying to build this complex machine,
Right.
but you're assembling each part in a different room with slightly different tools and blueprints.
Ooh, I like that analogy.
And then when you finally try to bring all the pieces together, surprise, surprise, they don't fit.
It's like when you try to follow a recipe, but you're using a different oven and ingredients for each step.
Yeah, you're pretty much guaranteed to end up with a disaster.
And I bet these inconsistencies aren't just frustrating. They can actually delay releases and even impact users, right?
Absolutely. Trying to track down a bug that only shows up in production because of some tiny little environmental difference is like the worst. It's a huge waste of time, slows down your releases, and can even damage your users' trust if it leads to errors or downtime.
So the single environment paradigm,
Yeah.
it's all about getting rid of all that complexity and those inconsistencies.
Exactly. It's not just about merging environments, though. It's more about adopting strategies that let you work safely and effectively in one unified environment.
Okay, now we're talking. Tell me more about these strategies. How do you make testing in production safe and reliable? Like, that sounds kind of risky.
Well, one of the key approaches is something called progressive deployment. It's kind of like dipping your toes in the water before jumping into the pool.
I like that. So no more holding your breath and hoping for the best.
Exactly. Instead of releasing a massive update all at once, you roll it out gradually to minimize the risk.
Okay, so what does that look like in practice?
So you often use techniques like canary releases where you deploy to just a small percentage of users and monitor them super closely for any issues.
Kind of like a test group.
Exactly. And if everything looks good, you gradually increase the rollout until everyone has the new version.
So if something goes wrong, it only affects a small group and you can roll back quickly. It's like having a safety net built right into your deployment process.
Precisely. And another really useful tool in this progressive deployment world is feature flags.
Feature flags, right? Tell me more about those.
So these basically let you turn features on or off for different groups of users.
So you can test new features with a select group, get feedback, and then refine them before they go live for everyone. It's like having a secret beta program built right into your application.
That's a great way to put it. And that's just the beginning. There are also techniques like test-driven development, which make sure the code is high quality from the very start. And then there's continuous integration and continuous delivery, which automate the whole build, test, and deployment process.
Okay, so I'm starting to see how all these different pieces work together to create this more streamlined and robust development workflow. But I have to admit, the idea of testing in production still makes me a little nervous. How do you make sure those tests don't mess things up for real users or, corrupt your live data?
That's a great question, and it's where things get really interesting. There are actually several different techniques for testing in production safely and effectively, and some of them, like dry runs and shadow traffic, actually let you test your code in a production-like environment without actually affecting any real users or data.
Wait, so you can run tests in production without actually impacting anything. Tell me more about those dry runs and shadow traffic things.
Yeah, so a dry run is basically like a dress rehearsal for your code.
Okay.
You execute the code in the actual production environment, but you don't let it make any changes.
So it's like previewing an email before you hit send. You get to see how it looks, make sure there are no typos or anything embarrassing before you send it out to the whole world.
That's a perfect analogy. And then shadow traffic takes that concept a step further.
Yeah.
It involves duplicating a portion of your live traffic and sending it to a separate testing environment.
Interesting.
This lets you see how your application behaves under real-world conditions without affecting your actual user's experience at all. It's kind of like having a secret shopper for your software. They go through all the motions, give you feedback, but their actions don't actually affect anything.
I love that analogy. So it sounds like with dry runs and shadow traffic, you're basically testing in production without the risks. But
Yeah.
then that kind of makes me wonder, if we're already testing so thoroughly in production, why even bother with separate testing environments at all?
Yeah, that's a question a lot of organizations are asking themselves these days. And there isn't really a simple answer.
Hmm.
Separate testing environments definitely still have their place, especially for those really big, complex systems where even a small mistake in production could be super costly.
So it's like a trade-off then. You're weighing the efficiency of having just one environment against how much risk the organization is willing to take on.
Exactly. It all comes down to picking the right tools and strategies based on the specific needs of your app and how much risk you're comfortable with.
So earlier you mentioned some even more advanced techniques for testing and production. I'm ready to get into the nitty-gritty here.
Yeah.
What are some of the strategies that really push the boundaries of what's possible with this single environment thing?
Well, one technique that's getting a lot of attention lately is automatic rollbacks.
Automatic rollbacks.
Yeah. Imagine this. Your monitoring system detects a problem right after a deployment. Maybe there's a sudden spike in errors or performance just tanks. And instead of scrambling to manually fix everything, your system just automatically rolls back to the previous stable version.
Oh, that's like having a self-healing system. No more late-night emergency fixes.
Yeah. Well, hopefully not. The whole point of automatic rollbacks is to keep downtime to an absolute minimum and make sure users don't even notice that anything went wrong. You just set up specific conditions or thresholds,
Uh-huh.
and if those get triggered, bam, rollback happens automatically without anyone having to lift a finger.
So you're basically setting up these tripwires that say, like, if this happens, hit the undo button right away.
That's a great way to think about it. It's all about being proactive and addressing problems before they turn into major disasters.
This is honestly making me feel a lot better about the whole testing and production thing. It sounds like you're building in all these safety nets.
And it doesn't stop there. We also have these awesome tools like feature flags and configuration management.
Right, right. Feature flags. Can you remind me how those work again?
Sure. So feature flags are basically like switches that let you turn features on or off in your app without having to change any code.
Okay.
So you can try out a new feature with a small group, get feedback, and then gradually roll it out to more people.
Gotcha. Like having a secret menu at a restaurant.
Exactly. And configuration management kind of takes that idea to the next level. It lets you change the parts of how your application behaves without having to deploy new code.
So you're not just like turning features on and off. You're actually tweaking and fine-tuning them on the fly.
Exactly. You can change settings, adjust parameters, even modify the entire flow of your app all through configuration files or essential management system.
Wow. Okay. My mind is officially blown. What are some real-world examples of how people are using these techniques with this single environment approach?
One really interesting example is something called chaos engineering.
Chaos engineering. That sounds intense.
It is.
Huh?
It's basically where you intentionally introduce failures into your production environment just to see how your system handles it.
Wait, you're purposely breaking things in production. Isn't that kind of dangerous?
I know it sounds counterintuitive, but the whole idea is to uncover weaknesses in your app and make it more resilient. So you might do things like simulate a server crashing or a network outage or a huge spike in traffic, all to see how your system responds under pressure.
So it's like a stress test for your software,
Yeah.
you know? You're pushing it to its limits to make sure it can survive anything.
Exactly. And it's becoming super popular as more companies move towards these distributed and cloud-based systems where failures are just a fact of life.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
If you know your system can handle the worst case scenario, then you can be a lot more confident that it can handle those everyday challenges too.
That's the whole point of chaos engineering. You're embracing uncertainty and building systems that are truly anti-fragile.
Anti-fragile.
Yeah.
Well-
Systems that don't just survive disruptions, but actually get stronger because of them.
I like that. This has been a wild ride so far. We've talked about the problems with the traditional multi-environment approach, gone deep on the principles of the single environment paradigm, and uncovered some mind-blowing techniques for testing and production. Before we wrap things up, I want to bring it back to our listeners. I feel like we've given our listeners a lot to digest.
Mm-hmm.
So for someone who's like hearing about this single environment paradigm for the first time, is this something they could realistically try out in their own projects? Or is it more for, big tech companies with tons of resources?
I get what you're saying. And the answer is It really depends. You see the single environment paradigm. It's not like a one-size-fits-all kind of solution.
Mhm.
It's more like a set of principles and practices that you can adapt to different kinds of projects, whether it's a tiny startup or a huge corporation.
So it's less about the size of your team or how complicated your application is,
Yeah,
and more about your mindset and being willing to try something new.
exactly. It's about being open to experimenting,
Yeah.
always learning and working together as a team.
Okay, so let's say a developer is listening to this and they're really intrigued by this paradigm. What are some practical things they can start doing in their own work? Like, where do they even begin?
Well, my advice would be start small. Don't try to change everything at once.
Yeah.
Pick one or two techniques that you find interesting and experiment with them in a safe environment.
So, like, dip your toes in the water before you jump in head first.
Exactly. You could start with feature flags to get more control over your releases, or you could explore automated testing to give yourself a bit of a safety net.
Those are great ideas. What about the culture side of things? You mentioned collaboration being important. How can teams create an environment where this kind of paradigm can really thrive?
Communication is key. You need to break down those walls between the developers, the operations folks, and the security team.
Silos. Break down the silos.
Exactly. Encourage people to talk openly, share responsibility, and really feel like they own the quality of the product.
So it's not just about the tools and techniques, it's also about building trust and making sure everyone's working towards the same goal.
Absolutely. The single environment paradigm really shines when everyone is on the same page, open to feedback, and eager to learn from each other.
This deep dive has been super insightful. We've gone from the theory to the practical stuff and even touched on the cultural aspects of this whole paradigm shift.
It's been a pleasure chatting with you about it.
But before we let you go, I have one last thought-provoking question for our listeners to think about. As we move towards this world of single environments, where the lines between testing and production are getting blurrier, what does that mean for the future of software development? What do you think?
That's a great question. Are we moving towards a future where deployment becomes a thing of the past, where it's just a constant flow of updates and experiments?
And how will that change the roles of developers, testers, and operations teams? Will we see those lines blur too,
Hmm.
leading to this like super integrated and collaborative approach to building software?
Those are some really exciting questions, and I think we'll keep exploring them as the single environment paradigm continues to evolve.
Well said. And to our listeners, we encourage you to keep this conversation going. Check out the resources we've shared, try out these techniques, and let us know what you find. Maybe you'll be the one shaping the future of this whole paradigm.
The possibilities are endless.
I love that energy. A huge thanks to our expert for guiding us through this fascinating world, and to all our listeners out there. Keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep pushing the limits of what's possible in the world of software development. Until next time, happy coding.